One fateful encounter over the English Channel in the autumn months of 1941 would forever alter the balance of aerial warfare in Europe. 60 massive American bombers reduced to twisted metal and smoke in a matter of hours. Hundreds of trained airmen lost to the void in what seemed like mere moments. At the heart of this devastation flew an aircraft that aviation experts had initially dismissed as obsolete, a throwback to outdated thinking. How could such an unconventional design become the source of nightmares for every pilot climbing into a Spitfire or manning a gun position aboard a flying fortress? More puzzling still, why has the full story of this remarkable machine been obscured by the passage of time? The grey autumn skies above the Channel hung thick and oppressive as the distinctive rumble of aircraft engines shattered the morning quiet. British pilots had spent more than 12 months learning the deadly patterns of combat against German Messerschmitt fighters. These sleek, dangerous aircraft had become familiar adversaries, their capabilities well understood through bitter experience. The RAF had gradually developed tactics to counter them, and there was a growing confidence among fighter command that British Spitfires could finally hold their ground against the Luftwaffe's best. Then everything changed in the span of a few violent seconds. A strange aircraft appeared in the combat zone, its silhouette unlike anything the British pilots had encountered before. The compact, rounded fuselage and the deep growl of its radial power plant marked it as something entirely foreign to their experience. Before defensive maneuvers could be initiated, a Spitfire Mark V disintegrated under a withering barrage of cannon shells, the pilot given no opportunity to even transmit a warning to his squadron mates. Another British fighter attempted an evasive turn, but the mysterious attacker rolled with shocking speed, plunging into a dive before reappearing with devastating accuracy, guns hammering away at close range. The British squadrons were gripped by confusion and mounting dread. What manner of aircraft was this? The new fighter bore no resemblance to any German design in Allied intelligence files. Some observers speculated it might be a captured French aircraft pressed into Luftwaffe service. Others suspected an elaborate deception. The reality proved far more troubling than anyone imagined. This was the combat introduction of the Focke-Wulf 190, an aircraft soon to earn the fearsome nickname Butcher Bird among those who faced it. This machine defied every conventional principle of fighter design. It carried more weight than seemed practical, featured a broader profile than aerodynamics favoured, and drew power from a radial engine configuration that aviation experts considered a relic of the past. Yet when unleashed in actual combat conditions, it demolished every assumption about air superiority. With it came the systematic destruction of Royal Air Force confidence. From the contested skies above occupied France to the frozen killing grounds of the Eastern Front, from dusty airstrips in the North African desert to the apocalyptic firestorms raging over German industrial centres, this aircraft would carve its legend into history with cannon fire and destruction. It would obliterate the carefully constructed myth of Allied air superiority, strike terror into the hearts of bomber crews, and trigger a desperate technological race for survival. But what circumstances allowed such an unlikely design to rise to dominance? And despite all its devastating capabilities, why did it arrive too late to alter the ultimate outcome of the war? To understand these questions, we must journey back to the very origins of this remarkable aircraft. The closing years of the 1930s witnessed revolutionary changes in aerial combat technology. Germany's Luftwaffe had emerged from the restrictive shadows of the Versailles Treaty, openly defying international agreements while constructing war machines that would soon control the skies over much of Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 represented what many considered the apex of modern fighter design. Its sleek lines and sharp performance had proven their worth in the Spanish Civil War, where it consistently outperformed, outmaneuvered, and outfought everything fielded by Republican forces and their Soviet supporters. By the time 1939 arrived, the Bf 109 had established itself as a thoroughbred of the skies, combining speed, grace, and lethality in a single package. Yet beneath this veneer of success lurked significant vulnerabilities that concerned thoughtful observers within the Luftwaffe. The cramped cockpit of the Bf-109 severely limited pilot comfort and situational awareness during extended missions. The liquid-cooled engine, while powerful and efficient, presented a critical weakness. A single well-placed bullet piercing a coolant line could transform the engine from a source of power into a useless, rapidly overheating mass of metal. Perhaps most troubling, the narrow landing gear positioned close to the fuselage center condemned countless young German pilots to injury or death before they ever engaged enemy aircraft in combat. Historical records indicate approximately 1,700 Luftwaffe personnel perished not in aerial combat but in takeoff and landing accidents involving the Bf-109. This represented an unacceptable waste of trained manpower. Within the corridors of the German Air Ministry, strategic thinkers began contemplating uncomfortable scenarios. What if Britain or France developed and fielded superior fighter designs? What if the vaunted Bf-109 encountered a more capable opponent? Germany needed insurance, a second option in its fighter arsenal. This alternative needed to possess different strengths, capable of enduring harsher operational conditions and demonstrating greater survivability under combat stress. The thoroughbred racehorse had proven its speed, but war demanded workhorses as well. Enter Kurt Tank, an engineer whose philosophy diverged dramatically from his contemporaries chasing speed records and performance benchmarks. Tank had survived the brutal ground combat of the First World War, witnessing firsthand how sophisticated technology crumbled when exposed to mud, rain, mechanical stress, and simple exhaustion. His experiences convinced him that the coming conflict would not be decided by fragile, high-strung machines requiring perfect conditions. Victory would belong to robust, dependable platforms capable of operating under the worst imaginable circumstances. His proposal shocked the aviation establishment. Tank advocated for a radial engine configuration, specifically the BMW 801. This broad, massive power plant seemed almost crude compared to the streamlined inline engines that graced the noses of Spitfires and Messerschmitts. Aviation experts dismissed the idea almost immediately. Radial engines belonged on bombers and American naval fighters, not on cutting-edge European interceptors competing for air superiority. Tank remained unmoved by such criticism. A radial engine could absorb battle damage and continue functioning. It required less maintenance under field conditions. Its very mass could serve as armor, protecting the pilot from frontal attacks. These practical advantages outweighed aesthetic concerns about streamlining. Beyond his choice of power plant, Tank reimagined the entire relationship between pilot and machine. The landing gear would be mounted far out on the wings, providing stability on rough, unprepared airfields where Bf-10-9s regularly toppled over. The canopy design would be raised and extensively glazed, offering visibility in all directions and transforming the cockpit from a claustrophobic coffin into a hunter's observation post. Controls would be logically arranged and clearly labelled, the cockpit spacious enough to accommodate young men with minimal training rather than demanding the adaptability of seasoned veterans. This entire design philosophy clashed with prevailing Luftwaffe doctrine. The German Air Force, like most European aerial services of that era, prioritized agility in dogfighting and rate of climb to altitude advantage. Tank envisioned something fundamentally different. He wanted a true multi-role weapon capable of ground attack missions, bomber interception duties, and still possessing sufficient performance to duel enemy fighters when circumstances demanded. His fighter would be heavier and tougher than conventional wisdom suggested, built for versatility rather than specialization. This was not an aircraft designed to impress crowds at peacetime air demonstrations. This was a machine engineered to survive the chaos of modern warfare. The Air Ministry initially hesitated, but the gathering storm of European conflict could not be ignored. Britain was conducting trials of the Supermarine Spitfire, rumoured to match or potentially exceed the Bf-109's capabilities. Germany could not afford complacency. In 1938, official specifications were issued calling for development of a second frontline fighter capable of complementing the Bf-109 and filling its operational gaps. The timing carried tremendous urgency. Within 12 months, all of Europe would be consumed by flames, Poland would be crushed in weeks, France would collapse in months. The skies above Britain would transform into a crucible where national survival hung on the outcome of every aerial engagement. When that crucible demanded more than mere speed, when circumstances required resilience and adaptability above all else, Kurt Tank's unconventional vision stood ready to provide salvation. The pieces were falling into place. Despite conventional wisdom, despite expert skepticism, despite the doubters who clung to traditional design principles, a new apex predator was taking physical form in German factories. Soon its wings would slice through the smoke and chaos of total war. Soon its shadow would fall across every front where German forces engaged their enemies. And when it finally revealed itself to the world, Allied airmen would learn a harsh lesson written in blood and fire. The butcher bird had been conceived not from pursuit of elegance or aesthetic perfection, but from cold calculation of battlefield necessity. It was the product of hard-won experience rather than theoretical idealism. Summer arrived in 1939 with Europe teetering on the brink of cataclysm. In a secluded aircraft hangar, the first prototype of Tank's vision assumed three-dimensional reality. The machine displayed its characteristic round nose, the powerful engine concealed within a tightly fitted cowling. The wide-track undercarriage sat planted firmly, resembling a predator settling into a crouch before launching itself at prey. On the first day of June, test pilot Hans Sander lifted the experimental aircraft into the German sky. His landing brought him back drenched in perspiration and flushed with a mixture of exhilaration and concern. The cockpit environment had reached 55 degrees Celsius during flight. He described the experience as akin to flying with his feet positioned directly in a furnace. The engine delivered impressive power, but the intense heat threatened to incapacitate any pilot attempting extended operations. Yet beneath these serious flaws, unmistakable promise shone through. The initial BMW 139 radial engine provided raw strength but proved mechanically unreliable. Engineering teams returned to their drawing boards, eventually selecting the BMW 801 as the optimal power plant. This 14-cylinder, twin-row radial beast generated in excess of 1,500 horsepower. To counterbalance its substantial weight, designers repositioned the pilot's seat further aft in the fuselage. This modification simultaneously addressed the overheating crisis and created a cockpit environment that was actually comfortable rather than torturous. For the first time in German fighter development, the aircraft seemed designed to serve its pilot rather than punish him for the privilege of flight. Then came the innovation that truly distinguished the Focke-Wulf from all competitors. A single-lever engine management system, designated the Kommandogerät, functioned as a mechanical mind for the power plant. With one smooth motion, this system automatically adjusted fuel mixture, propeller pitch, and supercharger engagement. No longer would pilots find their hands dancing frantically across multiple controls during the stress of aerial combat. They could focus entirely on tactics and gunnery, trusting the machine to optimize its own performance. In an environment where every fraction of a second separated life from death, this represented genuine revolution in aircraft design. The armament philosophy followed Tank's practical approach to engineering challenges. Devastating firepower, ease of maintenance, and adaptability to various mission profiles guided every decision. Early prototypes mounted twin machine guns in the nose section, along with additional weapons in the wing roots, all synchronized to fire through the propeller arc without striking the blades. Soon, heavier cannon were integrated into the design. By the time production aircraft began rolling off assembly lines, each fighter bristled with the teeth of a true predator, its talons sharpened for any conceivable engagement scenario. The wing construction itself told the story of Tank's underlying vision with remarkable clarity. Forged as a single continuous piece rather than assembled from multiple components, the wings possessed unusual structural integrity. Aerodynamic plates concealed joints and reinforced stress points. This was emphatically not a delicate thoroughbred requiring gentle handling. This was a warhorse, its wings engineered to absorb punishment and continue functioning. The wide-track undercarriage stood ready to operate from rough, unprepared fields where conventional fighters would crumple their landing gear or flip onto their backs. In 1941, the FW-190A, designated Anton in the phonetic alphabet system, emerged from production facilities. Powered by the BMW 801C power plant, the aircraft could achieve speeds exceeding 660 km per hour. Its armament proved brutal by any standard. 4 7.92mm machine guns combined with two 20mm cannons to deliver devastating volumes of fire. The Luftwaffe assigned the type to Jagdgeschwader 26, the unit commanded by the legendary Adolf Galland, for operational deployment on the Channel front. There, in the contested skies above France and the narrow waters separating Britain from the continent, the legend of the butcher bird truly began. When the Focke-Wulf first engaged Royal Air Force patrols in combat, the impact reverberated throughout fighter command. Spitfire Mark V's, the aircraft that represented Britain's pride and aerial defence, fell from the sky trailing flames and smoke. The new German fighter climbed rapidly to altitude, rolled with unprecedented agility for such a large aircraft, and struck with firepower that could dismantle a Spitfire in a single passing burst. British pilots returned from missions shaken and confused, speaking in hushed tones of an enemy that seemed to violate the established laws of aerial physics. Reports described impossible maneuvers, devastating weapons, and survivability that defied conventional wisdom. Then fate delivered the Allies an extraordinary gift wrapped in confusion and navigational error. June 1942 brought a cloudy day over the Channel. Luftwaffe pilot Armin Faber, disoriented in thick cloud cover and suffering from spatial confusion, mistook a Welsh airfield for his home base in occupied France. He landed his pristine FW-190 intact on enemy territory. Within hours, British intelligence personnel had their hands on one of Germany's most closely guarded secrets. Royal Aircraft Establishment test pilots at Farnborough subjected the captured fighter to exhaustive evaluation flights. Their findings confirmed Fighter Command's worst nightmares. At low and medium altitudes, the Butcher bird comprehensively outclassed the Spitfire Mark V in virtually every performance parameter that mattered in combat. The RAF scrambled to respond with appropriate urgency. The Spitfire Mark IX entered accelerated production as an emergency measure to restore some measure of parity to aerial engagements. Yet the Focke-Wulf did not remain a static design frozen at its initial configuration. Kurt Tank and his engineering teams embraced continuous evolution as a core principle. Variants emerged incorporating reinforced armour protection, provisions for bombs slung beneath the fuselage, and rocket projectiles mounted under the wings. The FW-190 transformed from pure fighter to ground attack platform to bomber-destroyer, and even, though with limited success, to night fighter. Each transformation expanded its operational envelope, validating Tank's fundamental design philosophy. Adaptability wielded power equal to raw performance. By 1943, specialized variants carried 30mm cannons capable of literally tearing heavy bombers apart with single well-placed hits. Other aircraft bore 210mm rockets, crude and inaccurate but psychologically terrifying, capable of breaking apart tight bomber formations through sheer explosive force and shrapnel effect. From its origins as a sleek hunter, the FW-190 had evolved into a muscular, versatile predator. Each version incorporated lessons learned in actual combat, shaped by the brutal demands of total warfare. The aircraft grew more dangerous with each successive model. From those early test flights that nearly cooked pilots alive in superheated cockpits, through the battlefields where it shattered Allied confidence and tactical assumptions, the Focke-Wulf 190's evolution told a story of persistence, creative improvisation, and ruthless dedication to practical effectiveness. It had become everything Kurt Tank promised at the outset. A cavalry warhorse built specifically for the harshest, most unforgiving fields of modern conflict. But the greatest challenges still lay ahead, gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. As Allied bomber forces grew to unprecedented strength and the sky darkened with the thunder of thousands of engines, the Butcher Bird would face its most severe test. The mission would shift from fighting nimble fighters to confronting aerial fortresses bristling with defensive armament. September 1941 marked a turning point in the aerial war over Western Europe. The English Channel lay calm under pale autumn sunlight as a new and menacing shadow crossed the narrow waters separating Britain from occupied France. This was not the familiar silhouette that RAF pilots had grown accustomed to engaging. The outline was stubbier, broader, radiating threat in a way the Messerschmitt never quite managed. On that particular morning, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26, Adolf Gallen's elite Abbeville boys, took the FW-190 into its first true combat trial against British forces. The results proved immediately and catastrophically one-sided. RAF Spitfire. Mark V's, representing the cutting edge of British fighter technology and the pride of fighter command, suddenly discovered themselves hopelessly overmatched. Mission reports flooded back to headquarters describing a new German fighter that rolled faster through evasive maneuvers, climbed more quickly to advantageous altitude, and struck harder with heavier armament concentrated in devastating bursts. Dogfights that had previously felt like evenly matched contests now concluded in terrifying seconds. A brief flash of cannon fire, a dark plume of smoke, and another Spitfire would be spiralling into the cold waters of the channel below. Within weeks of the type's combat introduction, the RAF issued grim operational orders. Avoid engagement with the FW-190 unless tactical circumstances made combat absolutely unavoidable. For Luftwaffe pilots, the arrival of the new fighter brought intoxicating confidence. They had grown weary and anxious dueling Spitfires while flying fragile Messerschmitt 109s, where a single tactical error could prove instantly fatal. Now, with the Butcher Bird beneath them, they experienced a surge of professional optimism. The wide landing gear made takeoffs and landings significantly less treacherous than the narrow-stance Bf-109. The extensively glazed canopy provided vision comparable to a hunting bird of prey. The radial engine mounted directly in front of the cockpit could absorb tremendous battle damage while still bringing its pilot safely home. Experienced airmen described it as a machine that cooperated with them rather than fighting against them, a partner in survival rather than an opponent to be mastered. But warfare never confines itself to a single theatre of operations. By late 1941, the FW-190 began spreading eastward across Europe. Jagdgeschwader 51 and Jagdgeschwader 54 started receiving the new fighter for deployment on the vast Eastern Front. There, above the endless plains and brutal conditions of Russia, it proved its worth all over again under vastly different circumstances. In the savage cold of winter operations, the wide undercarriage handled rough, frozen, unprepared airfields where the narrow-track Bf-109 frequently suffered accidents. Soviet Yak and Lei-GG fighters fell before its concentrated cannon fire with depressing regularity from the German perspective, tragic frequency from the Soviet viewpoint. During one particularly intense week in January 1943, a single FW-190 unit claimed nearly 90 Soviet aircraft destroyed, though such victory tallies remain subject to historical debate and verification difficulties. North Africa, too, would hear the distinctive growl of the BMW radial engine echoing across desert skies. To cope with fine sand particles that threatened to clog engine intakes, German engineers designed and fitted specialized filters for tropical operations. FW-190S roared across Tunisian airspace, slashing at Allied convoys and pounding British armour from low altitude with bombs and cannon fire. Pilots of Jägergeschwader 2 and Jägergeschwader 26 found themselves diving low to strafe and bomb, their wings carrying ordnance as they transformed from pure fighters into versatile attack platforms. The aircraft proved itself not merely a fighter, but a flexible instrument of destruction capable of adapting to ground attack, bomber escort, or interception roles as tactical circumstances demanded. Flying the Butcherbird was not without significant risks and challenges. Dive bombing operations exposed certain stability issues that demanded every ounce of pilot skill to manage safely. Sudden turbulence could throw the aircraft into uncontrolled rolls that required immediate, precise corrective action to recover. Yet pilots developed deep respect for the machine's fundamental resilience and survivability. Time and again, FW-190S returned from combat missions riddled with bullet holes, engine cylinders torn apart by enemy fire, wings scarred and perforated, yet still capable of landing on damaged airstrips. This survivability became its silent but crucial weapon, an unspoken assurance to pilots that they possessed a reasonable chance of surviving another day to continue fighting. As 1942 unfolded across the European theatre, Allied commanders grew increasingly desperate to understand this phantom that had so thoroughly disrupted their air operations. Then came the blunder that shifted the balance of intelligence knowledge. In June, as previously mentioned, Luftwaffe pilot Armin Faber made his fateful navigational error and landed his intact FW-190 at an RAF base in Wales. Within days, British test pilots at the Royal Aircraft Establishment flew the captured machine through exhaustive trials, confirming Fighter Command's worst suspicions. The Spitfire Mark V was indeed comprehensively outclassed across most performance parameters. Only with the rushed introduction of the upgraded Spitfire Mark IX could Britain hope to regain competitive parity in aerial combat. Still, for nearly 2 full years following its combat introduction, the Butcherbird dictated terms of engagement across Western Europe. Its mere presence forced the Allies into a costly cycle of redesign, adaptation, and innovation at a pace they had not anticipated or budgeted for. And with each new variant that emerged from German factories, incorporating longer wings for improved high-altitude performance, heavier armour for bomber interception missions, greater firepower through larger caliber weapons, the FW-190 demonstrated the versatility and adaptability that Kurt Tank had envisioned from the very beginning. The machine had proven itself in every conceivable role and environment, from the Channel Coast to the eastern steppes to North African deserts. Now it prepared to face its ultimate challenge and defining mission. Against the aerial fortresses. Dawn broke over Germany on October 14, 1943, revealing a sky alive with the thunder of hundreds of engines. American bombers, the famous B-17 Flying Fortresses, crawled eastward in tight defensive formations, their aluminum wings catching pale morning light. Their target was the ball-bearing manufacturing centre at Schweinfurt, a mission that would burn itself into the memory of everyone who participated or witnessed it. For the men inside those bombers and the hunters waiting in ambush above the clouds, this day would be remembered as one of the war's bloodiest aerial battles. FW-190S rose to meet the bomber stream, their wings heavy with weapons that seemed grotesquely oversized for single-seat fighters. Beneath each wing, long tubular rocket launchers extended outward, crude but psychologically devastating. These were 210mm Werfer Granit 21 rockets, unguided projectiles that sacrificed accuracy for explosive power. When launched into the heart of a bomber formation, they proved absolutely devastating. The Luftwaffe called them bomber crackers. To the crews of the 8th Air Force, they were thunderbolts of death delivered without warning from fighters that should not be carrying such massive weapons. As the bomber stream penetrated deeper into German airspace, white contrails twisted and braided against the blue sky, marking their progress toward the target. FW-190S dove from superior altitude, pilots leveling their aircraft, triggering rocket salvos, and sending storms of high-explosive lancing into the tight formations. Explosions bloomed like dark, terrible flowers among the bomber boxes. Shrapnel tore through thin aluminum skin, ripping wings from fuselages, scattering engines like burning meteorites across the sky. A single rocket detonation could damage 3 or even 4 bombers simultaneously in one shattering blast of fire and steel fragments. Then the cannons added their voices to the destruction. 4 20mm guns, sometimes augmented by a massive 30mm weapon, spat their fury into the massive aircraft. A fortress staggered in formation, flames licking hungrily across its wing, crew members scrambling desperately toward escape hatches as parachutes blossomed far too late to save falling men. Another bomber spun toward Earth trailing fire, its fuel tanks igniting the fields below in spectacular conflagrations. But this was no simple one-sided massacre despite German advantages. From each B-17 bristled 13 50-caliber machine guns, each waist gunner, ball turret operator, and tail gunner firing desperately into the chaos surrounding their formation. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the air in glowing red and white arcs against the blue backdrop of sky. The entire aerial battlefield became a cage constructed from intersecting lines of fire. And through this maelstrom, the butcher birds flew headlong, their radial engines howling at full power, wings vibrating as rounds punched through aluminum skin and framework. Out of this chaotic violence emerged a tactical innovation that froze American bomber crews with pure existential dread. German aces Georg Peter Eder and Egon Meyer pioneered a new approach to bomber interception, leading their squadrons not from the traditional stern approach, but directly head-on. Instead of attacking from behind where tail gunners held defensive advantage, they pointed their aircraft noses straight at bomber cockpits. At combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, collision seemed mathematically inevitable. For a few terrible frozen seconds, gunners manning the forward turrets watched the black Balkenkreuz crosses growing larger and larger, cannons flaring with muzzle flashes, death rushing directly into their faces at incomprehensible velocity. At the final impossible instant, the FW-190s would peel away, leaving shattered cockpits, wounded or dead pilots, and burning aircraft tumbling from their formations toward the earth thousands of feet below. Survivors would remember these attacks as experiences of pure, concentrated terror unlike anything else the war offered. One waist gunner later described it in an interview. They looked like black crosses flying directly out of the sun itself. You fired at them and prayed desperately you might hit something vital, and then you just braced for the inevitable collision that somehow never quite came. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage inflicted. The results of the Schweinfurt raid proved catastrophic for American forces. 60 bombers fell that single day, 60 flying fortresses, each carrying a crew of 10 trained airmen. Hundreds were lost to cannon fire, to structural failure, to parachutes that failed to deploy or deployed too late. The mission became known throughout the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday, a designation that conveyed the scope of trauma inflicted. For the Luftwaffe, it represented a moment of tactical triumph, undeniable proof that the butcher bird could gut even the most heavily armed and defended prey in the sky. Yet triumph carried its own shadow of doom. Every attacking pass cost aircraft and irreplaceable pilots. The rockets that proved so devastating also weighed down the FW-190s, making them slower and more vulnerable once long-range escort fighters arrived on the scene. And escorts were indeed coming, approaching rapidly on the timeline of the war. In the spring of 1944, long-range fighters, particularly the legendary P-51 Mustang, capable of escorting bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany, arrived in theatre strength. The balance of aerial power shifted overnight. What had been a hunt now transformed into a duel. And more often than not, into systematic slaughter of German fighters by numerically superior and tactically positioned American escorts. Still, during those brutal months before escort fighters ruled the skies with impunity, the FW-190s fought with ferocious determination. They launched themselves into bomber streams, ignoring impossible numerical odds, sometimes forming specialized Sturmgruppen or storm battalions of heavily armored FW-190s specifically designed to close to point-blank range, or even ram bombers if ammunition was exhausted. Their cockpits were lined with additional steel armor plates. Their wings were reinforced to withstand the stress of extreme maneuvers. They flew straight into the concentrated defensive fire of bomber boxes, their 30mm cannons capable of destroying B-17s with single well-placed bursts. The price paid by these pilots defied imagination. They faced seas of tracer fire, clouds of anti-aircraft flak, the endless drumbeat of 50-caliber rounds hammering against armor plate and aircraft structure. Some returned with wings shredded to skeletal frameworks, engines half destroyed by battle damage, blood staining their cockpits from wounds suffered in combat. Many never returned at all, falling to defensive fire or swarming escorts. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out its experienced pilot corps at unsustainable rates. The Butcherbird continued proving its worth, but Germany was rapidly running out of trained men capable of flying it effectively. Even amid desperation, German innovation continued seeking solutions. Night after night, British bombers rained incendiary devices and high explosives across German cities in area bombing campaigns. Radar-guided night fighters, primarily twin-engine Bf-110s and Ju-88s, could not be manufactured in sufficient numbers to stem the tide. So the Luftwaffe turned again to the FW-190, sending them up alone into darkness. Single-seat predators hunting in an ocean of night without guidance or support. The tactic earned the designation Wild Sow, or Wild Boar, a name that captured both its desperation and its audacity. Without radar equipment or ground control guidance, pilots hunted purely with their eyes and instincts. They used the glow of searchlights probing the darkness, the flames of burning cities illuminating targets from below, the silhouettes of Lancaster bombers crossing the face of the moon. It was tactical madness, flying blind through their own anti-aircraft fire, sometimes colliding with friendly aircraft, frequently failing to return from missions. But when the desperate tactic worked, results proved devastating. Bomber crews, already terrified of flak and mid-air collisions, now faced sudden bursts of cannon fire from invisible predators materializing from the darkness without warning. The Butcherbird had transformed into a symbol of German desperation and continued ingenuity. From rockets fired in daylight to reckless hunts conducted in darkness, it embodied the ferocity of a nation fighting with its back against a wall. But the tide of war continued turning against Germany. By 1944, American Mustangs owned the high altitudes. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings scythed through the air, punishing any German interceptor that lingered after attacking bomber formations. The FW-190's considerable strengths, including brutal firepower, rugged construction, and tactical adaptability, could not offset Germany's crumbling industrial resources and catastrophically dwindling supply of veteran pilots with combat experience. The hunter had become the hunted in the most literal sense. And yet, even as losses mounted to unsustainable levels, even as fuel grew increasingly scarce, even as the youngest pilots arrived at squadrons with barely enough training to keep their aircraft airborne, the FW-190 never entirely lost its fearsome aura. To the men inside the bombers, its distinctive silhouette still meant terror was approaching. Its engine howl still signaled death was near. To its remaining pilots, it remained a machine that offered them a fighting chance to survive, even when facing impossible odds stacked against them. The climax of the Butcherbird's operational history was written in fire over Schweinfurt, in choking smoke over Hamburg, in the pitch-black skies above Cologne, illuminated by searchlights and burning cities. In those desperate hours, the aircraft proved simultaneously its genius and its fundamental limitations. It could shatter flying fortresses. It could break crew morale. But it could not break the inexorable tide of industrial warfare. The tragedy lay not in any failure of the machine itself. The tragedy resided in the loss of the young men who flew it. Hurriedly trained replacements hurled again and again into the storm until their ranks thinned to almost nothing. The butcher bird had more than earned its fearsome reputation. But in doing so, it consumed the very human resource that sustained its effectiveness. From the Channel coast to the killing ground above Schweinfurt, from Moscow's outskirts to Tunisian deserts, the FW-190 had demonstrated its lethal capabilities. But the nature of the war was changing fundamentally. And as the Allies gained undisputed control of European skies, the butcher bird faced its most painful chapter ahead. Not written in triumph, but in slow, grinding decline toward inevitable defeat. By 1944, the skies over Europe had transformed beyond recognition. Where once the butcher bird had ruled through firepower and maneuverability, now dark swarms of Allied escort fighters filled the heavens. P-51 Mustangs, with their distinctive laminar flow wings and seemingly endless operational range, flew alongside bombers all the way into the deepest heart of Germany and back again. For the first time in the war, Luftwaffe hunters found themselves systematically hunted by more numerous, better-positioned opponents. The FW-190, still feared and respected, now struggled against overwhelming odds. Rocket tubes and additional armor plates that made it so effective against bombers also slowed it significantly in fighter-versus-fighter combat. Overloaded with heavy cannons optimized for destroying large aircraft, it became increasingly clumsy prey for nimble, unburdened Mustangs. American fighters slashed through formations of Sturmgruppen before they could even approach close enough to bring their devastating short-range weapons to bear against bomber formations. The proud thunder of the BMW radial engine was systematically drowned out by the distinctive whine of Packard-built Merlin engines powering American fighters. Diving faster, striking from superior tactical positions, possessing fuel reserves for extended combat, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts extracted a terrible toll. German losses mounted at a pace the shattered industrial base and training infrastructure simply could not sustain. The veteran pilots who had made the FW-190 so deadly were gone, killed in action, captured, or too physically and mentally exhausted to continue flying combat missions. In their places came boys, some barely out of their teens, handed the controls of butcher birds with only a handful of flight hours logged in training. Against combat-experienced American aces accumulating multiple kills, their life expectancy measured in missions rather than months. The aircraft remained capable. The human element had collapsed. Desperation drove continued innovation and new design variants. The Dora series, particularly the FW-190D-9, emerged with an elongated nose section housing the liquid-cooled Junkers Jumo 213 inline engine. It could soar higher and fly faster, finally achieving competitive parity with the Mustang at altitude where the radial engine variants had struggled. Pilots nicknamed it the long-nosed Dora, praising its elegant lines and improved high-altitude performance. Yet too few examples reached operational units, arriving too late in the war's timeline. Chronic fuel shortages left even available aircraft grounded more often than airborne, sitting idle while Allied bombers passed overhead unmolested. Then came what many considered the ultimate evolution of Kurt Tank's original vision. The TAR-152, featuring long, graceful wings, designed specifically to duel Allied fighters in the thin air above 30,000 feet altitude. In the rare engagements where it saw combat, the TAR-152 proved its exceptional capabilities, slashing Allied aircraft from the sky with apparent ease. But fewer than 100 examples ever reached operational service. By the time these magnificent machines arrived at frontline units, Germany itself was collapsing under the combined weight of the Allied advance from east and west. No fighter, regardless of how technologically advanced, could reverse the fundamental tide of total war. Even the butcher bird itself fell victim to Germany's desperate circumstances and reliance on forced labour. Sabotage crept insidiously into production lines. In factories manned by prisoners from occupied nations, compelled to work under threat of death or deportation to concentration camps, small acts of defiance took root and grew. A rag carefully stuffed into a fuel line where it might not be discovered until catastrophic failure. A critical wire deliberately clipped in locations where cursory inspections would miss the damage. Evidence of this resistance emerged decades after the war. One FW-190 that crash-landed in a Soviet swamp in 1943 lay undisturbed and forgotten for decades. When recovery teams finally retrieved it in 1989 and restorers began detailed examination, they discovered its fuel line had been deliberately blocked by a saboteur's hand. The aircraft had been betrayed from within, defeated not by enemy action, but by the very people forced to construct it. Allied airmen saw the transformation as well. In 1941 and 1942, RAF pilots had genuinely dreaded encountering the FW-190 in combat. By 1944, while they still respected its capabilities, the psychological dynamic had reversed. One American Mustang pilot wrote in his memoirs years after the war concluded, "If you encountered one of them, you understood the pilot possessed genuine courage. But courage alone was no longer sufficient. They came at us heavy, slow, running out of tactical options. We cut through their formations like scythes harvesting wheat." The metaphor was apt and terrible. For the Luftwaffe, the cost had become unbearable and unsustainable. Entire Gruppen were systematically wiped out in spans of weeks rather than months. Available aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel to fill their tanks. On the first day of January 1945, in a desperate gamble designated Operation Bodenplatte, hundreds of FW-190s and Bf-109s hurled themselves at Allied airfields in a massive coordinated attack intended to destroy Allied air power on the ground. It was meant to be a defiant blow demonstrating continued German fighting spirit. Instead, it became a massacre of historic proportions. 250 fighters lost in a single day, and with them perished the last remaining strength of Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe. The aerial force that had terrorized Europe was broken. The FW-190 had not failed as an engineered machine. It remained versatile, rugged, and genuinely lethal right up to the final days of the European war. But warfare is not determined by blueprints and specifications alone. Wars are fought and won with adequate supplies of trained men, sufficient fuel to power machines, superior numbers allowing tactical flexibility, and above all, time. In each of these critical categories, Germany's reserves had run completely dry. The nation that had shocked the world with lightning victories in 1939 and 1940 now faced systematic destruction from multiple directions simultaneously. The immediate aftermath proved bitter for all involved. Wrecks of butcherbirds littered the European landscape from French hedgerows to frozen eastern swamps. Some lay hidden in barns, concealed by farmers who feared Allied retribution or Soviet occupation. Others simply rusted where they fell, their black Balkenkreuz crosses gradually fading beneath moss and accumulated snow. For Allied intelligence teams combing through the wreckage, each destroyed aircraft told the same fundamental story. A formidable enemy had been broken, defeated not primarily by design flaws or tactical deficiencies, but by the sheer overwhelming weight of industrial might and numerical superiority brought to bear against it. And yet, even in comprehensive defeat, the silhouette of the butcherbird persisted in memory and legend. It had been conceived from defiance of conventional wisdom, birthed from a vision that directly challenged accepted engineering principles. It had ruled contested skies, struck genuine terror into experienced air crews, and forced rapid innovation among enemies scrambling to match its capabilities. Now, as the Third Reich itself crumbled into rubble and unconditional surrender, its wings lay broken across a continent, but its legend had only begun its flight through history. The Second World War ended with cities reduced to ruins, skies emptied of their predators and prey alike, and Germany itself carved into occupation zones and political division. Amid the wreckage of total defeat lay the twisted frames of thousands of Focke-Wulf 190s, silent carcasses of a predator that once struck fear across continents. Yet from those shattered wings emerged a legacy that continues echoing through aviation history to the present day. For the Allied powers, the butcher bird represented lessons written in the blood of their airmen. It had forced Britain to dramatically accelerate Spitfire evolution, rushing the Mark IX into combat production as an emergency response. It compelled America to extend operational range of fighter escorts, a development that gave birth to the strategic dominance of the P-51 Mustang. Every significant innovation in Allied aviation from 1941 through 1944 bore the shadow of the FW-190's influence. This single fighter design had dictated the pace of technological arms race, demonstrating conclusively that survivability, concentrated firepower, and operational versatility mattered as much as pure speed or aerodynamic elegance. To the pilots who flew it, the FW-190 represented far more than mere machinery. It was a partner in the desperate struggle for survival. Airmen who had previously cursed the fragility and unforgiving nature of the Bf-109 discovered in the butcher bird a companion that forgave pilot errors, absorbed tremendous battle damage, and offered them legitimate hope of living to see another sunrise. Veterans who survived the war would speak of it decades later not with fear or regret, but with genuine professional respect. It was a warhorse that carried them through circumstances and odds that should have been mathematically impossible to survive. In its final evolutionary forms, the long-nosed Dora variants and the rare TAR-152 high-altitude interceptor, the basic design demonstrated what German engineering could achieve when desperation met genuine ingenuity. The Dora could engage the Mustang on equal terms in most performance parameters. The TAR-152 could climb higher than virtually any piston engine fighter of its era, offering a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been possible had time and circumstances been different. They served as reminders that even as the Reich collapsed under the weight of its own evil and the Allied counter-offensive, flashes of engineering brilliance still emerged from German workshops and design bureaus. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the FW-190 resides not in statistics of victories or defeats, but in what it symbolized about the nature of technological warfare. It embodied a fundamental paradox, a genuine marvel of engineering constructed in service of an ultimately doomed and morally bankrupt cause. It represented simultaneously a triumph of practical design philosophy and a monument to strategic futility. For every flying fortress it shattered, more would be built to replace losses. For every Spitfire it outmaneuvered, another would rise to continue the contest. The butcher bird could terrify, could kill, could force respect, but it could not reverse the inexorable tide of industrial total war. Today, a precious few FW-19s have been painstakingly restored to flying condition. When these rare survivors appear at air shows, gleaming in fresh paint, their BMW radial engines rumbling with that distinctive deep growl, audiences witness ghosts from an age when steel birds determined the fates of entire nations. To see one climb into modern skies is to glimpse history made tangible, to hear echoes of a conflict that reshaped human civilization. These flying museums remind us that history encompasses not only moral victories and defeats, but also the machines, the engineering decisions, and the human choices that shaped a world consumed by total war. In the final analysis, the FW-190 teaches a straightforward but profound truth about the nature of modern conflict. Wars are not won by the sharpest blade alone, nor by the most advanced technology in isolation. Victory belongs to the side possessing adequate reserves of time, the reach of sustainable industrial production, the depth of trained human resources, and ultimately the endurance of entire nations mobilized for total war. The butcher bird flew with unmatched ferocity during its period of dominance, but even the fiercest predator cannot survive when the entire world ecosystem turns hostile. It remains a testament to human ingenuity applied to destruction, a reminder of what technical brilliance can achieve, and a sobering illustration of how even excellence in engineering cannot overcome fundamental strategic and moral bankruptcy.